Hi everyone, it's Lisa from IDreaminSoap. In this video I'm going to be making a wood grain soap, hence the convenient filming in front of my wood grain doors. Now I'm not the creator of this technique in any way, and I'm sure if you did an internet search, just like for a hanger swirl or a drop swirl or something like that, you'll find lots of examples out there. What I'm doing in this video is just showing you how I do a wood grain soap, and I've tried to include perhaps a few hints and tips, so maybe if you're thinking of making one yourself and you've not tried it before, you may actually find these hints and tips useful. Come on, let's go and make some soap. I've already prepared all of my oils and my lye solution, and they're both at around about 80 to 85 degrees. I add sodium lactate to all of my soaps at a rate of 1 teaspoon per pound of oils, and you need to add this to the cooled lye solution. I have all of my colourants made up into these little swatch samples, and I find this really useful because I can now pick my colours knowing exactly what result I'll get whenever I use them in my cold process soap. They're all made up at a standard rate of 1 teaspoon per pound of oils, and therefore I know that I can maybe tweak them and perhaps make them a little bit darker or lighter to make my needs. So these are the colours I've settled on. I'm based in the UK, so these are from either UK or European companies. So I've got Golden Shimmer from Mica Mama, Black Gold from Mica Mama, and Brown Oxide from Sensory Perfection. I'm also going to be using some titanium dioxide and some activated charcoal to add some lightness or darkness to the colours as I need it. I always pre-mix all of my colours in some olive oil, and I use olive oil in addition to my batch oils, and this just adds a little bit to your super fat. With most colourants, generally micas, I find they just mix pretty easily, but things like oxides, so the brown oxide that I've got here, I do find that they're much more difficult to disperse. So I'm just using this technique that I've picked up off of Terry from Tree Marie Soapworks with the palette knife to actually go through and smush all of the little grains and just make sure I've got this oxide really nicely dispersed and I've got no specks in the colourant at all. The other mica colourants I find disperse easily, so I'm just going to mix them in these little stainless steel pots that I use all the time and just mush them around a little bit with some olive oils, and they'll blend in nice and easily. In addition to the 3 solid colours that I've chosen, I also want some lighter and darker versions, so I'm just adding titanium dioxide and some activated charcoal to some extra little pots of the colours, just so I've got a little bit more variety. So once all of my colours are prepared, it's now time to mix up my batter. So just adding my pre-prepared lye solution to my oils. And I always like to just hand stir just for a little while, just give everything a chance to mix together nicely before I start to stick blend. Now one thing I always do, like many, I make sure that I've burped my stick blender properly, but before turning it on I always spend a little bit of time just wiping around sort of the top of the solution, and here what I'm doing is I'm trying to pop any bubbles that have risen to the surface. What I quite often see is that people do pop a stick blender into their batter and they burp it and all the bubbles come up, but then they instantly turn the stick blender on, and if you look carefully what happens is that then drags the bubbles back into the batter solution and just mixes them back in again. So it is best just to take a little bit of time just to make sure that if you just mix around before starting your stick blender, and just make sure all of those little bubbles are popped before you turn the stick blender on. Now I really want to make sure that I take my batter to just an emulsified state. It's really important to make sure that your batter stays fluid throughout the pour for this technique, so therefore I'm just doing a combination of very minor stick blending and then quite a lot of hand blending to make sure that I've got to emulsion. Sometimes what I'll even do is I'll stop everything and just pause for a minute, and I'll go away and leave everything sitting for a minute or so, and then come back and give it a little stir, and you'll see that potentially it's progressed without you putting any more sort of stick blending or anything into it. And then once I'm happy that I've brought my batter to a nice emulsion, I'm just going to divide off the parts that I need. Now I'm going to have the bulk of my batter one of the brown colours that I've chosen, and then I want some little highlighting colours to make the sort of lines in the wood grain. And you only need a small amount of batter for this, so I'm pretty sure I just poured off about 150 mils of batter for each of the colorants that I was going to use. Then I've just added each of the pre-prepared colorants that I've made and just given these a good mix in, and then finally dividing up my fragrance oil, and then we're all ready to go. Now the fragrance oil that I've chosen to use is a fragrance oil that doesn't accelerate trace. Again, I'm in the UK, so you may not be familiar with the fragrance oils that I use, but this is a fragrance oil called Galaxy of Stars from a company called Sensory Perfection. Now at this stage I've got everything mixed in, but I've really still not got any sort of trace on my batter. Now you do want to keep your batter really fluid throughout the pour of this technique, but you do need to make sure you've at least got a very light trace. If you pour before you've got a light trace, what's going to happen is the colours are just all going to just meld together, and you're just going to end up with a big sort of weird coloured blob rather than a wood grain effect. And then I'm just emptying each of my highlight colours into some squeeze bottles. Now you absolutely don't need to do this, and I know some people don't like using squeeze bottles because it increases your washing up. I just find that the way that we're going to add this to the main colorant, you want to get in as nice and close as you possibly can, and I find using squeeze bottle gives you a lot more control over what you're doing. But you could just pour them in or use a spoon or something, and that would work just as well. But this I just found worked for me. Taking my mould, and I've just propped it up on one side. I've just used a tea towel. I find that's actually really quite useful because it's something that you could then make thinner and thinner to gradually lower your mould down. Now the reason you want to tip your mould is because you want to actually pour down the side of the mould, and if you've got the mould sitting flat on your work surface, you're going to have your batter just dropping in on top of the previous batters, and if you think about like how you do a drop swirl, you're going to have all the batters mixing together and dropping into each other, and we don't want that. Now I'm just taking each of my colorants and I'm just gently adding them to the top of my main brown batter, and the idea here is you really just want those to sit on the surface without penetrating through and mixing all together, and that's, as I said, why I use the squeeze bottle, because it gives you lovely control when you go through and do this. And then the pour itself is actually really quite straightforward. If you've got your mould tipped up nicely, you can now just take your jug and you can just move across the mould, gradually pouring your batter in. Now, speed when you're thinking about moving across is, if your batter is quite nice and thin, you don't want to go too ridiculously fast, because remember, you do want to see the grain lines in the wood, and if you're whipping across really quickly, then it's quite likely that your lines are going to be really, really thin. At the moment, I've just got the video going at the speed that I was actually going across when I was doing this pour. As your batter starts to get thicker, you might want to start speeding up with your pour, but you should see the lines forming within your soap mould as you're doing this. Now, to create an effective wood grain style, you're going to want some sort of knots and things in your wood. So can you see that every now and again I stop and just wiggle my jug backwards and forwards, and what this does, it gives you an extra sort of blob of batter that then goes in, and it forces the rest of the batter to curl round it, and it gives you that sort of wood grain style. And then I'm just going to speed this up and just go through and just quickly pour in the rest of my batter, carrying on with the same technique, every now and again popping in some little sort of wood eyes, as it were, until my mould is full. It's quite likely that your batter may start to get a little bit thicker as you get towards the end of your pour, and in this case it just means that what you want to do is just keep going backwards and forwards on your loaf mould, but now you might want to actually make that movement a little bit quicker so you're not ending up with really massively thick lines. Once your mould is full, then give it a nice tap down, spray with a little bit of rubbing alcohol and cover, and I always C-pop my soaps, so therefore I'm just going to put them into an oven that's heated up to sort of the lowest temperature it will go, and then turn the oven off immediately and leave them there overnight. Now, the way you cut this soap is really important to make sure that you maximise the wood grain effect. So what you want to do when you look at the top of your soap is you need to consider that top is now going to be the height of your bars. So as you can see with mine, I'm just dividing mine into 3 chunks, and that will give me my 3 heights of my bars. And then once you've done that, what you need to do is you need to rotate the bars so that you sort of cut across the width of the loaf. And it's this that actually gives you the wood grain effect. Now, I found with mine, as I initially cut them, I couldn't really see the design that well, but then what happens as the soap dries out a little bit over sort of the next day, then the designs come through and you can see that wood grain a lot better. So I'll just leave you with some pictures of the finished soap. I really hope you liked this video. If you did, then please click the like button and maybe leave a comment or a question below. If you want to see what I'm making in future, then why not click the subscribe button? Other than that, have a good day everyone, and happy soaping!